Like Josh said, we're going to unpack that question of how do we show mercy? And Jesus kind of continues this conversation. And he goes into Matthew chapter 18. And in verse 22, it starts off and he tells this parable. He says, there was this master. And he was collecting the debts from his servants. And he approaches this one servant and he says, I want what I'm owed. And the servant says, well, I don't have it. And he says, well, the consequence is I'm going to sell you along with your wife and your children to another owner to work until you pay my debt back. And so the servant falls on his hands and knees in front of the master and he says, no, please, have mercy on me. Have pity on me. And the master looked at him and he had pity on him. And he let him go free and he forgave his debt. But as that servant went out, he saw another servant who also owed him a debt. About 2 denarii, which is about pennies to what he owed the master. And he looked at that servant and he said, give me what I'm owed. The servant says, well, I don't have what I owe you. And he grabbed him by the neck and he choked him and he said, pay me what I'm owed. And he couldn't pay him. He said, please just have patience with me and I'll pay you back everything that you owe. But rather than have patience, that servant had him thrown in jail. And some other servants, they saw this happen and they went back and they reported back to the master what had happened. And so he called that servant in. And in verse 32, it says this, Matthew 18:32, he says, then the king called in the man and he had forgiven and said, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. He forgave you. But that servant didn't show forgiveness back. Should you have mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you? Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. I love the question he asked. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you? I find it funny, because we're just like that unforgiving servant, like Josh was saying. We're so quick to ask for mercy from the master, but we hold it back from others. We go to God, God, forgive me for what I've done, and he forgives us. But when someone wrongs us, we don't show that mercy. We hold it back. So how do we show mercy? It's with a pure motive. And our motive has to be for people to find Jesus. I love this quote by C.S. Lewis. He says, to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable, because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. Now, I'm going to read that again. To be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable, because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. Translation, what that means is God has forgiven us, so we forgive others. If he's forgiven us, then we need to extend that forgiveness to others. And I'm not saying that's easy. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy. But if our motive is for people to find Jesus, and we're withholding forgiveness from others, what picture are we painting of Jesus? I heard a preacher say it like this: you may be the only Bible that someone ever reads. So how are we representing Jesus to others? Are we representing a God who is merciful, who is loving, who is gracious, who's slow to anger? Or are we representing a God who holds grudges, holds back, quick to anger, and quick to not show grace? This was the unmerciful servant. He had false motives. He wasn't sorry. He just didn't want to be punished. He didn't want to face the punishment, so he pretends that he's sorry, but then he really shows his true motive. And his true motive is this: he was all about himself. He said, I'm going to get what's mine. It's all about me, which is what our culture says. Our culture says someone wrongs you, you forget about them, and you move on. But as we're going to find out, Jesus teaches the opposite. So if we want to show mercy to people, our motives have to come from a pure heart. And when you think pure, I don't want you to think perfect. I want you to think proper. We have to have the proper attitude and the proper actions to show mercy. So let's look at the proper attitudes. What does our attitude have to be if we're going to show mercy? We have to have the attitude of Jesus. if we're going to show mercy. And what was Jesus' attitude? It was this. Jesus looked at people and saw their soul, not their sin. Now, what I'm saying there is, I'm not saying we excuse sin, because Jesus never excused sin. He called sin, sin. We see this with the adulterous woman in John 4. We see this when Peter denies him. Like, he's going to call sin, sin. But he forgave it. Imagine how different our country, our world would be if we saw people and saw their soul and not their sin. We saw people how God sees people. And how God sees others as people who were created in his image. When God looks at people, he sees his son, his daughters. He sees people who are fearfully and wonderfully made. He sees that about us. He sees that about everyone. Imagine how different this world would be if we stopped looking at people's sin and just saw them how God sees them and saw their souls and saw that, hey, this person really needs Jesus. Instead of making assumptions like everybody knows Jesus just because we live in the South. But we actually looked at people and said, that person needs Jesus. That person needs Jesus. And I'm going to represent him to them. I'm going to see their soul, not their sin. Their sin's not going to keep me from approaching them. Their sin's not going to keep me from forgiving them. But no, I'm going to see them at their soul and go, they need Jesus. Essentially, Jesus was for people. This is the attitude we must have. We have to be for that family member that wronged us. We have to be for that person, that boyfriend, that girlfriend, that friend that hurt us. We have to be for that coworker who upset us. We have to be for that boss that gets on our nerves. We have to be for the politicians who we may not agree with. We got to be for people. Because that's what Jesus was. He was for people. And that's not easy. It's easy to say, right? It's easy to say, yeah, I'll be for that person that hurt me. But it's another thing to actually do it. Which goes into the next point. It's only through that type of attitude that we will show the proper actions. With our words and deeds, we must love and forgive people. No hidden agendas. Not, okay, I'm going to forgive them just because it's the right thing to do. And then just hold on to that anger. Or like I've seen with high schoolers. Oh yeah, I forgave that person. But then they talk about it behind their back. Which I've also seen adults do. No passive aggressiveness. Like, yeah, I forgive you. Let's just move on. Let's go on to something else. No, it has to be pure and genuine. Because you want to know how Jesus was pure and genuine with the way he forgave us? He died on a cross. He was beaten, spit on, mocked, ridiculed for us to forgive us. He didn't have a hidden agenda. He wasn't picking and choosing who he was going to save, who he was going to forgive, but he said, no, I'm going to forgive everybody. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. That whosoever, that means all people, regardless of what you've done. He doesn't hold a grudge, but he forgives, and he's genuine with the way that he loves. And there's so many examples of this. There's the U.S. gymnast who forgave her doctor who sexually abused her. The son who forgave his father. The killer who was brought to Christ by a missionary, who that killer killed the missionary's family. Or the daughter Shelby Houston, who forgave her dad's killer. Her dad was a police officer who was killed in the line of duty. And rather than her ridicule her father's killer, rather than her call for vengeance and all these different things, she forgave him. So check out this video.
I remember having conversations with my dad about him losing friends and officers in the line of duty. I have heard all the stories you can think of, but I've always had such a hard time with how the suspect is dealt with. Not that I didn't think there should be justice served, but my heart always ached for those who don't know Jesus. Their actions being a reflection of that. I was always told that I would feel differently if it happened to me, but as it's happened to my own father, I think I still feel the same. There has been anger, sadness, grief, and confusion, and part of me wishes I could despise the man who did this to my father, but I can't get any part of my heart to hate him. All that I can find is myself hoping and praying for this man to truly know Jesus. I thought this might change if the man continued to live, but when I heard the news that he was in stable condition, part of me was relieved. My prayer is that someday down the road, I'd get to spend some time with the man who shot my father. Not to scream at him, not to yell at him, not to scold him, simply to tell him about Jesus.
I really don't know if I could do that. If I could look at a man who shot my father and do that. But here's what I do know. That we're able to do that when we lean into Jesus. When we lean into the Holy Spirit. Because at the end of the day, we're humans. We're not perfect. And we're sometimes not going to be able to forgive the right way and do these things the right way. But when we tune into the Holy Spirit, we say, God, I need you to give me the strength to do this. He'll do it. And I know that because that son who forgave his father, that was me. In January of last year, we got news that shocked our family. And as I'm going back to Bible college, I'm having to go into my last semester of my senior year, and that's all I can think about. And I just let it boil up inside. And I held on to it. And I was like, my dad wronged me and my family. And I'm just supposed to forgive him. No. He can forgive me. That hidden agenda. Oh, I'll forgive them, but they're going to forgive me first. No. And for 6 months, I just held on. And eventually, it became this burden, and I just kept carrying and carrying and carrying. And then finally, I talked to Josh about it. And he said, you got to forgive him. And I sat in that room, and in my mind, I went, no. He can forgive me. And a couple days went by, and I'm eating dinner with my mom. Lady that she is. We were talking about something that had nothing to do with the whole situation. She gave me this simple response. It's kind of a Sunday school answer, but she said, Peyton, WWJD. And I looked at my mom, like, man, I can't argue with that answer. But it's true. What would Jesus do? And then later on that night, as I was praying, I felt like the Holy Spirit was, and he's like, yeah, baby, what would Jesus do if he was in your shoes? I said, he'd forgive him. The next day I drive up, my dad happened to be home. I kept carrying this burden. And I looked at my dad in the eye. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to say. But I looked at my dad and I said, Dad, I forgive you. And in that moment, it was like a weight was lifted off of my shoulder, because here's the thing. The reason why we forgive is not just because it's the right thing to do. The reason why we forgive is because when we forgive, we help people find forgiveness in Jesus. When you show mercy with pure motives, you receive mercy, and people see Jesus in you. And that's what we're called to do. We're called to be Christ-like. Being Christ-like means to be like Christ. And if Christ on the cross looked at the mockers, looked at the people who put him there, and he cried out, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. We need to do the same. As Jesus told Paul, he said, my grace is sufficient for you. I want to turn it around. Because he's true. God's grace is sufficient for us. But if God's grace is sufficient for us, then our grace, then our love, and our kindness, and our mercy should be sufficient for others. I don't know what you came in here with tonight, but maybe you walked in here and you're carrying that burden. That burden of unforgiveness that you've been carrying that's turned to bitterness. And tonight you're tired of it. Then tonight, as we move into this time of response, respond by leaving that weight at the altar. There's an altar at your seat. And forgive that person before God. But then I want to challenge you. That's the easy part. The hard part, reach out to that person and tell them you forgive them. Maybe you walked in here tonight and you're carrying another type of burden. It's a burden of sin. I'm here to tell you, there's grace for that too. Because on the cross, that justice, because we call for justice, you know what justice was for us as sinners? Separation from God for eternity. Hell. But oh, on that cross, Jesus paid our debt so we don't have to experience that justice. It's just like the song we sang today. I've been carrying a burden for too long on my own. Maybe you're in here today and you've been carrying a burden for too long on your own. And tonight is the night where the burden is lifted. Tonight's the night where the chains fall off. Tonight is the night where hearts are healed and souls are made whole because you find it in Jesus and in Him alone. And so tonight as we respond, that's my challenge. Lay the burden down. Lay the burden of unforgiveness down and forgive. Because just like Jesus said in Matthew 8, blessed are those who show mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Church, let's respond.